spoken here in 2 months. No, 2012, not 2013. Whoa. In 14 months, he then spoke on what then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called the economic statecraft, something that I think everyone agrees is a crucial part of the toolbox we use to project a U.S. narrative in the world. As Raj put it, quote, harnessing American ingenuity to advance global development and, in the process, strengthen our own nation's economy is what we should be doing. The numbers tell the story. Since 2001, AID has formed more than 1,600 public-private partnerships with over 3,500 partner organizations with an estimated value of more than $20 billion with a B in public and private funds. But the work of USAID and public-private partnerships doesn't just provide a bounce to our economy and to our jobs picture. It also enhances our security. At a time when too many see our foreign policy in kinetic terms, like drones and special ops and Guantanamo Bay prison, soft power diplomacy, or I would call it smart power diplomacy, delivers life-saving help to desperate people and improves their image of America. It's an invaluable foreign policy tool. Think Thailand in 2004 and the devastating tsunami. All of you were old enough to remember that. In relief efforts, Americans and Thais worked side by side to deliver food and supplies. Americans lined up to donate blood. U.S. humanitarian assistance helped build trust with Thailand's government and with the Thai people. Building this relationship played an important part in the CT efforts, counterterrorism efforts, with Thai authorities, which were led to a very successful outcome just a little bit later. Segue to the Philippines, or Japan, or Pakistan, or even Iran after its devastating earthquake, and to today. Let's talk about Syria. Syria is a moral catastrophe. Secretary Kerry's announcement of an additional $380 million in humanitarian assistance in January brings our total commitment to $1.7 billion. That's good news, but we can and should do more. Increased aid can thwart recruitment from terror groups like the Nusra Front and ISIS, and can change the situation on the ground. The Wilson Center is proud to be the leading forum on maternal health and food security innovation through our Maternal Health Initiative and Environmental Change and Security Program, which Roger Mark heads. And a new ECSP report, Harvesting Peace, Food Security, Conflict, and Cooperation, examines the relationships between food insecurity and conflict, recommending that humanitarian and development partners work more closely together. So Raj, our friend Raj, is here to chart out where we are going in 2014. After he speaks, he will take part in an all-star panel featuring Earl Blumenauer, my very good friend who was elected to Congress in 1996 and whom I served with for many, many years. Earl is one of the brains behind USAID's first global water strategy, which was launched in May 2013. Our moderator is Jason Beaubien. Wonderful name. We've just been discussing this. NPR's Global Health and Development correspondent. And I'd also like to recognize many Wilson supporters in the audience, but particularly the ambassador from the Philippines, who is, where is he? There he is, sitting in the second row. Jose Cuisia. I've mentioned Earl, and I think that's it. Dr. Shah will now speak, and right after his remarks, the panel begins. So welcome all of you, and again, happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for your leadership here at the Wilson Center and certainly in Congress. The topic of today's conversation, which Jane was describing as we walked in, was really about defining America's role in the world. And you've been doing that for quite some time very effectively. Earl Blumenauer, it's great to be here with you. Thank you for being here. And I also want to thank Jason and Roger Mark, the ambassador, so many friends and colleagues. I too am glad folks are here. If you're walking through our offices, which are right next door and in the building, I think most of our folks are teleworking or got stuck in the snow. So this is great to see people out today. You know, it is true that this discussion should really be about what America stands for in the world and how we stand for it. And the answer to that question cannot only and just always be what our military is doing. It's got to be more comprehensive in a manner that captures certainly our diplomatic and development efforts in government, but also captures the full range of American institutional partnerships around the world in business, science, innovation, and technology. And it is true that when you look across sectors and around the world, whether it's in Colombia, where we're helping to bring Starbucks and small farmers together so that people can be reintegrated after a difficult war and guerrilla situation, or whether it's in Syria, where of the 4.5 million people inside of Syria that get relief, about 3.5 million get relief because of American support. Or whether it's in Afghanistan, where the 8 million kids and 3.5 million girls who are now in school are not talked about much, but are very much a part of whether that country succeeds, regardless of military presence over the long term. These efforts make a huge difference in shaping and defining the world in front of us. So I look forward to a discussion today about how to best execute that mission in a modern way. And in that context, I'd like to sort of pose a question to you, which is, how can we put the power of business, science, and innovation into the hands of those who serve this mission, whether it's serving on a humanitarian basis or working on the longer-term partnerships designed to end extreme poverty and build resilient democratic societies around the world? Now, it might be thought of as an unusual question, especially from someone in government leading an agency tasked with doing these things. But I think we have now learned and seen that the world is different than it used to be a few decades ago. A few decades ago, energy, investment, and resources that went into these parts of the world were in fact largely defined by public resource flows. Development aid, World Bank loans accounted for 60, 70, 80% of flows of capital into the countries we're talking about. Today, we are a small fraction of that. Despite having maintained our commitments and our level of commitments and even increased those commitments, we are thankfully far outstripped by private investment and business relationships in nearly every country in which we work. And so when we think about the future of engaging the world through developmental activity, we're not thinking anymore about just paying for infrastructure and services, as important as those activities are. Instead, we're now thinking about, as Earl Blumenauer and others have suggested in other settings, how do we build the kinds of partnerships that really, in a results-oriented way, can reshape the vulnerability in the world in which we live. We cannot pay our way out of extreme poverty, but if we engage businesses and companies, if we motivate scientists and technologists, if we use American innovation, whatever pocket of American society it comes from, including the government, and apply it to live out the founding premise upon which JFK created USAID, which was, we tackle poverty abroad, we make our world safer and more secure, we believe we can end extreme poverty within the next 2 decades. And that means ending extreme poverty for the 1.1 billion people who live on $1.25 a day. It means ending widespread hunger for the 860 million people that will go to bed hungry tonight. And it means virtually eliminating the reality of high levels of preventable child death for the 6.6 million kids that will die this year before ever reaching their 5th birthday. Now, it's easy to step back and say, you know, that sounds great, but those tasks are simply not achievable. But in each case, we've made huge progress. Child survival, as The Economist has previously noted, is probably the single greatest developmental achievement of the last 20 years in terms of what all of this work has actually done. In 1990, 44% of the global economy of the world's population lived on the rough equivalent of $1 or $1.25 a day. Today it's 22%, and in 20 years, if we do the right things, it could be 3%. But we're only going to get there if we do things a little bit differently. And so I'd like to describe to you today some of the efforts we've put in place over the last few years to reshape how we do our work and to motivate a greater degree of partnership to achieve those goals. First, we restructured how we work in order to partner more fundamentally with local institutions of all kinds all around the world. And in the last few years, we've supported more than 1,200 local institutions in 73 countries, a 50% increase over 2010. And what that means is we now have direct partnerships with local banks that are investing in small-scale agricultural businesses. It means we're funding and partnering with local civil society organizations that help women express their leadership capacity in rural villages in Africa. And what it means is we fund and work with women's groups in New Delhi so that when tragic things happen, they're able to have a voice and be more active and engaged, and partner with peer organizations here in America to carry out their task and their vision. We've also made a big pivot, as Jane mentioned, to focus on partnerships with private organizations and companies in particular. Today we have global relationship managers for our top 35 private sector partners. And what that means is we're working with Walmart in a dozen countries around the world to help reach hundreds of thousands of small-scale farmers, providing technical assistance and support, but also connecting them to a real market, in this case Walmart, that is going to be there for the long haul and sustain their gains. It means when we tackle a famine in Somalia, we're able to reach out to our partners at Cargill, and if they have, as they did, the capacity to redirect a $7 million shipment of rice and put it quickly into the Somali economy so that it can get to famine-affected areas, we can be more responsive and save more lives. And it means that we partner with our colleagues at Google to do everything from mapping communities around Lahore so that we can do a better job of finding and vaccinating young kids, to helping to invest in entrepreneurs creating new businesses to tackle extreme poverty and make a living for themselves by using private means. We've now sent a cadre of field investment officers to our missions around the world. And these are folks who, I think it's the only time in the Foreign Service we've had that cone of officer. What it allows us to do is to identify private investment opportunities and connect those investment opportunities to partners and investors here in the United States and around the world. So we're bolstering our traditional aid programs by, in the last year alone, using our capacity to provide loan guarantees to 26 new partners, mobilizing $500 million in 19 countries. And for every dollar we mobilize through our Development Credit Authority, for every $28 of private investment we mobilize, we end up spending about $1 when a loan fails and we have to cover part of the loss. So it's an extraordinary deal, and in these budget environments these days, we're always looking for good deals to advance our mission. We call this approach a new model of development, a model that relies on asking governments to reform the policies and programs that they've put in place to fight corruption and to prioritize the poor. But it's a model that also requires us to do things differently, to be more nimble and more flexible, to reach out to private sector partners at home and abroad, and to bring more engagement to tackle the kinds of problems we want to solve. When I started at USAID, about 8% of our resources were programmed through this new way of working. Today, we think it's about 40%, and we hope to increase that over time. And what that effectively means is that when there are disasters, instead of simply providing aid and assistance, we're also laying the groundwork for recovery and rehabilitation. I'm thrilled that our ambassador from the Philippines is here because that's a great example. The two most important things that happened in the U.S. response to the Philippines were far from the cameras. The first, as the ambassador knows, was a sharing of climate data and predictive data that allowed the Philippines government to evacuate 700,000 people before the typhoon hit. And we all saw those early estimates of death toll being far higher than what people ultimately found was the consequence. And it's in large part because in partnership we were able to get that done. The second part, also not seen on TV, was how we stood up energy systems and food systems and got health clinics back in operation. And yes, it was our wonderful military and developmental humanitarian partners doing great work, but it was also pulling together a consortia of companies, mostly local, that got those systems back up and running and did so quickly. And I think that's telling, because today it is those kinds of partnerships that give us the confidence to think that we can achieve extraordinary things. I mentioned the possibility of ending preventable child death around the world. How are you going to do that? Everyone should ask that question. Well, one answer is we partnered just a month ago with GE in East Africa to bring power and energy to hundreds of health clinics throughout East Africa. That project is going to be outstanding and is supported by one of the loan guarantees I was talking about earlier. We do have an estimated loss related to that we have to account for in terms of public funds. But in this case, GE said, you know what? This is such a good deal for us. We will pay for any loss you suffer using your credit guarantees. So at virtually no cost to the American taxpayer, through creative partnership, we're essentially going to bring power, light, and cold chain capacity to hundreds of health clinics throughout East Africa, which will help save lives and improve the delivery of health care. Opportunities to do this are endless, from Colombia to Syria to Afghanistan to Africa. So I'm eager to join the panel here because I believe that America has much greater capacity to do this work in this manner than we're tapping into today. And I look forward to your ideas as to how we kind of get there going forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I'm hoping that we can just have an open dialogue here. Feel free to jump in on each other as we go along, and we'll get to questions from the audience right towards the end as well. First, I'd like to ask you, Congressman, I think this question of what is the role of the private sector in the United States' image abroad and its development abroad, what is the proper role? Because on the one hand, it can do some amazing things, but I think there's also probably some concern that the interests of the private sector, the U.S. private sector, may not always be aligned with the best interests of the people in some of these developing countries, and there might be some cynicism from people in those places. And at the same time, you're dealing with budgets in Congress, which are shrinking. What do you see as the proper role and constraints of the private sector?
Well, I find what Administrator Shaw's described being very encouraging. I think that the legitimate long-term interests of American business is very much like this. And it's not some sort of misguided altruism. I mean, the history of GE, Coke, Walmart is not one of sort of benevolent, not worrying about the bottom line. I mean, these folks are serious about making a profit.
Absolutely.
But they've been able to identify, I think, areas where it just makes sense. If Coke has a keen interest in sustainable supply of water around the globe, the extent to which they're able to partner with USAID, other NGOs, it helps meet this objective, which deals with their ability to actually function in these companies. And it also helps them deal with market. Because if they are identified as part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem, people who are making their own economic choices will gravitate towards them. I think we have not always been regarded, I think of, Central America, United Fruit. I mean, there are a whole host of things where we have not measured up to our standards, and short-term profit has sometimes moved in directions that have not shown necessarily a favorable light, nor in the best interests of the company in the long term. But this, I think we've turned a corner. I think people are realizing that it's in their best interests, and we as a country are going to be well served if we can figure out how to identify, promote. The last thing I would say is that some of the technologies that are being utilized internationally, being on the ground immediately after the terrible earthquake in Haiti, and watching what a little Oregon NGO had been able to do, partnering with mobile banking. Whoa, this is now spread dramatically, may have applications here in our country. So simple, common sense technological advancement, whether it's irrigation, bicycles, or mobile banking, help internationally, can make a difference here at home.
And Roger Mark D'Souza, in your research and the work that you do you see an increasing role for the private sector in the fields that you're studying?
Thank you very much, Jason. I think it's a very good point. When I was listening to both them, both of you, what struck me was that the conversation around private public sector collaboration and partnerships really has changed. It really has shifted now. And this is something that we at the Woodrow Wilson Center have been looking at and have found globally that there have been really three driving trends that have helped change the dialogue and perspective on this new development approach, as you call it, this new model of development. And I think of it somewhat as a pep talk. And that pep talk really is looking at population. What's new about population variables? What does it mean? How do demographic trends have an impact? What does it mean in terms of consumption levels and vulnerability? You talk about the Philippines, you talk about East Africa. The second is looking at what we call event speed up. When this kind of catastrophe happens, we're seeing that the shocks reverberate more quickly and more widely than they have previously. And what's the role of technology in responding? And what is the corporate sector's role and the interest in looking at the bottom line? And what does it mean for overall development? And the last P in this pep talk for me is around partnership and recognizing that there's a changing development ecosystem, that really we're looking more at the corporate sector as a role, having a very key role in this development ecosystem. So these three trends are very important and significant in changing this dialogue about corporate engagement and its role in overall development.
Dr. Shah, do you hear, when you're going out to other countries, concern from people in those countries that the interests of GE in being part of this project might not be aligned directly with the people in India, for instance, or whatever? And how do you respond when you're in a country and you're trying to pitch a project like this?
Well, you know, I do hear that, and unfortunately, I think I hear it more often than it's appropriate. There's certainly a history in development of some pretty prominent companies having a very poor track record of community impacts, and that, I think, has lingered for decades. But you know, if you actually look at what's going on, it is pretty easy to get to the conclusion that this approach works. So, you know, we work in Ethiopia with DuPont. We've asked the Ethiopian government to make some reforms to its seed sector so that they can get Ethiopian scientists and varieties that are tested on the soil there to be effective, and then work with a whole host of seed companies to commercialize, in this case, hybrid maize and get it to farmers. And today DuPont is reaching 35,000 additional farmers, and we're in dialogue about how do we get to 3 million through partnerships with us and local partners there. The most important part of that, of course, has nothing to do with DuPont. It's all about what's going on at the farm household level. These are farmers who, you know, are usually barely subsistence producers. Maybe they'll sell a little bit of extra food on the market if they have produced it, and often have a 2 to 3 month period during the year that everyone refers to as the hungry season, when kids and mothers and fathers go without food or without adequate nutrition. The bottom line is that for these 35,000 households, they've now beaten that. They're producing significantly more food, they're selling it in commercial markets, they're reinvesting their profits and improving their food production, and this is the path to end widespread hunger without giving out food, but rather relying on the industry and enterprise of small businessmen and women, which is who these small farmers are. So in my view, this approach works, and it's a reason to do more of it, not an excuse to cut back on our public budgets or to cut back on our other necessary and critical complementary commitments.
Congressman, do you think, however, that there might be an interest in Congress, given budget constraints, to have almost everything get outsourced to private sectors in terms of aid and development?
There are some, perhaps, but the fact is that these partnerships actually do require a significant investment. The notion of your 35 managers who are working with these relationships. The more people understand that these are transformative. Sitting in the coffee exchange for Ethiopia in Addis, just watching these folks developing the capacity to be able to market their own product, building skills, not just marketing coffee, but other economic infrastructure, and that it is good for American businesses. I don't think we should look at this as a shortcut that is necessarily any easier or requires less investment. I mean, it's embarrassing how little we invest now, and we just had a budget that gave me heartburn with an 8% reduction. But part of that budget, which was interesting, and the reference was made to our work with International Water. We've developed, I think, an understanding in Congress that by investing strategically in water, focusing our attention better, getting more out of it, and building partnerships with the community of faith, environmental groups, other NGOs, that it is money extraordinarily well spent. So that budget line increased over a third in this tough climate. And I think the partnerships that are being described here with the private sector, with business, if we manage them right, I think Congress will go along with more. I couldn't resist today. I thought it might come up. You know, anytime Jane throws a party, I'm not surprised everybody's here. I'm surprised there's an empty seat. But I brought the latest